coming to you from 100 Velmont Drive, Nebraska City, Nebraska. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for our newest podcast. This is the fifth, I do believe, of a weekly series to discuss the Lewis and Clark expedition. The focus will be on the journal entries for the current week to inform our listeners as to where the Corp of Discovery is and what they're doing at the time, whether it be 1804, 1805, or 1806, and sometimes events prior to 1804 and sometimes events after 1806 will be discussed also. The language used in the podcast assumes that the listener tuned in to prior podcasts and thus has some background information in mind. This podcast is being produced and presented by the Missouri River Basin Lewis and Clark Interpretive Trail and Visitor Center in Nebraska City, Nebraska. You can find us on Facebook by searching MRB Lewis and Clark Center, and check out our website at lewisandclarkvisitorscenter.org. We are located along the Missouri River, along the route of the expedition. We have 3 floors of Lewis and Clark themed exhibits, walking trails, and a Plains Indian Earth Lodge replica. On August 30th, 1803, Meriwether Lewis makes his first journal entry as ordered by President Thomas Jefferson, the author of the enterprise, as he set out from Pittsburgh by keelboat, down the Ohio River to the mouth of it, where it meets the Mississippi. From there they were to travel upstream to St. Louis and make winter camp there before setting out for the Pacific Ocean the following spring. Back then, Pittsburgh had a population of just 2,000 to 2,500, and it went on to serve as a gateway to the west, particularly after the expedition. Things did not start out especially well, as Lewis writes in his journal on that first day. Arrived at Bruno Island, 3 miles below, halted a few minutes, went on shore, and being invited on by some of the gentlemen present to try my air gun, brought it on shore, charged it, and fired 7 times 50 yards with pretty good success. After which Mr. Blaze Seaness, being unacquainted with the management of the gun, suffered her to discharge herself accidentally. The ball passed through the hat of a woman about 40 yards distance, cutting her temple about the 1/4 of the diameter of the ball. She fell instantly, and the blood gushing from her temple. We were all in the greatest consternation, supposed she was dead, but in a minute she revived, to our inexpressible satisfaction and examination. We found the wound by no means mortal or even dangerous. Well, that's good news. And it would be the last time Lewis let any random person use the air gun, the very first day. They were setting out later than Jefferson had wanted in the season. The Ohio River was getting seasonally low, and they would often get the boat stuck due to the shallow water, and would have to get out and pull the boat through the riffles. On September 2nd, Lewis writes, we had gotten over Logtown Riffle, but find ourselves stranded again. Supposed it best to send out 2 or 3 men to engage some oxen or horses to assist us. Obtained 1 horse and 1 ox, which enabled us very readily to get over. Paid the man his charge, which was $1. The plan for Lewis is to meet Clark later on and find more recruits later on. Military men, woodsmen, young men. More details next week. August 29th to September 4th, 1804. The Corps started the week a couple of miles south of modern-day Ponca, Nebraska, and finished at modern-day Yankton, South Dakota. August 29th to September 4th, 1804. The Corps started the week a couple of miles south of modern-day Ponca, Nebraska, and finished at modern-day Yankton, South Dakota. On 29th of August, John Coulter is dispatched to find George Shannon, who got lost trying to find some horses that had wandered off. As mentioned last week, Shannon is upstream from the main group, and is headed upstream, thinking that the expedition is in front of them. August 29th to September 4th, 1804. The Corps started the week a couple of miles south of modern-day Ponca, Nebraska, and finished at modern-day Yankton, South Dakota. On August 29th, John Coulter is dispatched to find George Shannon, who got lost trying to find some horses that had wandered off. As mentioned last week, Shannon is upstream from the main group and is heading further upstream, thinking that the expedition is in front of him. He was trying to catch up to the Corps in his mind, not knowing that they were still behind him. On September 3rd, after setting out from the Yankton village, Clark writes that they can see two sets of tracks ahead of them, but that the tracks were not of two men together. So by September 4th, Coulter was gone all week in search of Shannon, but had not yet found him. And the week ends on that note, Shannon and Coulter's fates unknown. As for the main group, the Corps of Discovery camped among the Yankton Sioux for 3 nights. On August 30th, Clark writes, "We delivered a speech to the Indians expressive of the wishes of our government and explaining of what would be good for themselves. After delivering the speech, we made to 1 Grand Chief, 1 Second Chief, and 3 Third Chiefs, and delivered to each a few articles and a small present to the whole." Later in the day, Clark writes that the air gun astonished them very much. After night, a circle was formed around 3 fires, and those Indians danced until late. The chiefs looked on with great dignity, much pleased with what they had from us. We retired late and went to bed. A good first day among the Yankton Sioux. A little background on the Sioux. The Sioux were pushed westward by the Chippewa. The Sioux were relative newcomers to the Missouri River region. It was the Chippewa who gave the Sioux Nation this name. The Sioux bands actually called themselves by their real names, Lakota, Dakota, or in the case of the Yankton, Nakota. And as we can see from the entry, once again, Lewis's air gun amazed natives. They learned this among the Oto a few weeks prior, and it was a show of power that they would repeat over and over during and right after first contacts with new peoples. On the 31st, Clark writes about some of the information he had learned. He writes that some of the tribes are at war with other nations, while some of the tribes are at peace with those other nations. That there are 20 Sioux nations collectively, with between 2,000 and 3,000 men. Clark writes transcripts of the chief's speeches, and I will quote some of the highlights of those now from the journal. "We are poor and have no powder and ball. We are very sorry our women are naked, and all of our children are naked. No petticoats or clothes. I think our old friend Mr. Dorian, can open the ears of the other bands of Sioux, but I fear those nations above will not open their ears, and you cannot, I fear, open them." Most chiefs who spoke touched on the poor nature of their existence and lack of guns. They wanted to acquire firearms. Also, Pierre Dorian is mentioned. I just mentioned his name. The Corps met him in July 1804 while they were headed upstream. He was headed downstream to trade furs in St. Louis. He was a French-Canadian explorer-trapper. They employed him to be translator. He had spent much of the last 20 years among the Yankton trading with them. He spoke the language and he knew them well. When the Corps met the Yankton, he went out first to explain to them what was happening. He translated Lewis's speech to the Yankton. When the Corps set out on September 1st, they left Dorian with his friends, the Yankton. This was potentially a tactical blunder on the captain's part. As I quoted above, one of the chiefs says that Dorian could open the ears of other bands of Sioux that are further upstream, and that the captain's would likely not be able to open the ears. The captains, before they set out, they knew of the aggressive nature of the Tetons to traders. The chief adds that he fears the nations above will not open their ears to the Corps, and that the Corps will not be able to open them ears from them. But they left Dorian behind anyway. They proceed on from there slowly, and by the 4th camped on the Nebraska side near the mouth of the Niobrara River. August 29th to September 4th, 1805. The Corps are in central Idaho, starting near the modern-day city of Salmon, and they finally start to head north. On August 29th, still among the Shoshone, last week the Corps had acquired horses and a guide to lead them through the Bitterroot Mountains. On August 29th, Clark says that he trades his pistol, 100 balls, and powder, and a knife for a horse. On August 30th, John Ordway writes, "A fine morning. Bought 3 more horses, have now got 30 in all. The guide who has engaged with us to go to the ocean tells us that there is 2 ways to go, but the one bearing south is plains and a desert country without game or water. But the road to the north of the river is rough and mountainous, but could take us in 10 days to a large fork of the river." The river that old Toby was talking about there is the Snake River, which is ultimately the largest tributary of that much sought-after river, the Columbia. It shows how important having a guide is through this part of unknown country. Without old Toby, or another native guide, they would be lost at this point. For instance, the Astoria expedition, John Jacob Astor's quest to conquer the mouth of the Columbia River for purpose of international trade, whose overland party set out just a few years after Lewis and Clark's return, they get lost around this point, and many lives are lost from starvation and lack of water as a consequence. They would have had Clark's map, yet they made some poor decisions along the way, deviating from the Lewis and Clark route, and it proved a costly mistake, hence the importance of a good guide. Old Toby. On September 3rd, Clark writes, "At dusk it began to snow and rain. At 3 o'clock some rain. The last mountains we had to the east were covered with snow. We met with a great misfortune in having lost our thermometer, broken by accident." The next day he writes, "A very cold morning. Everything wet and froze. We detained until 8 o'clock to thaw the covering for the baggage, etc., etc. Ground covered with snow." So they're getting higher and higher, and the year is getting later and later, and temperatures are falling. Snow, rain, sleet. Still many mountains to cross. But the week ends with progress. They are proceeding on towards their goal. The broken thermometer is definitely unfortunate. FYI, the first reliable thermometer was invented in the early 18th century, although principles and rougher thermoscopes were around prior to that time. August 29th to September 4th, 1806. By August 29th, the Corps are approaching the Yankton Sioux village in southern South Dakota, and they still had not encountered the Teton Sioux, which they had certainly been expecting by now, being in their territory more than 100 miles. They viewed the Lakota as Missouri River pirates, and that is a quote, inspired by actual events that they experienced with them on the journey upriver in September of 1804. Getting closer to that in our upcoming 1804 podcast. On August 30th, 1806, Clark writes, "About 20 Indians was discovered on an eminence a little above us on the opposite side. Immediately after, 80 or 90 Indian men, all armed with fuses and bows and arrows, came out of the wood on the opposite bank about a quarter of a mile below us. They fired of their guns as a salute. We returned the salute with 2 rounds. We were at a loss to determine of what nation those Indians were. From their hostile appearance, we were apprehensive they were Tetons." He goes on to say, I then directed the man who could speak a few words of Sioux to inquire what nation or tribe they belonged to. They informed me that they were Tetons, and their chief was Black Buffalo. Chief Black Buffalo was there in 1804 and played a key role as they were coming upriver. They knew him well. Clark writes this next passage, and this is his stern warning. I told those Indians that they had been deaf to our counsels and ill-treated us as we ascended this river 2 years past, and they had abused all of the whites who had since then visited. I believed them to be bad people and should not suffer them to cross to the side on which the party lay, and directed them to return to their band, to their camp, that if any one of them come near our camp, we should kill them certainly. Clark could not have been much more direct and blunt there. He continues that, I also told them that I was informed that a party of all their bands were gone to war against the Mandans, and that they would be whipped, as the Mandans and Minataris had plenty of guns, powder, and ball, and we had given them a cannon to defend themselves. Now this is an interesting event. The cannon Clark's referring to is the Swivel Cannon that was originally on the keel boat. Giving the Swivel Cannon to the great Minatari chief at Mandan on the return voyage about 10 days prior to this date was an act of picking friends among tribes. The rationale was that it was of no use to the expedition, as it could not be mounted onto the White Pirogue, the largest remaining ship. The swivel gun was certainly a powerful weapon. It was a powerful symbol. The choice they made to give it as a gift is an interesting one. The Corps made it down as far as they could muster and camped that night on a sandbar, all hands quite on edge. On August 31st, progress is made downriver with little to note. On September 1st, Clark writes, 9 Indians ran down the bank and beckoned to us to land. They appeared to be a war party, and I took them to be Tetons, and paid no kind of attention to them at all. He adds in lengthy detail shortly after, about 15 minutes later in fact, they heard gunfire from behind them. Fearing that the expedition's hunters, 3 of them, who were out hunting, were being fired upon by these 9 Indians, Clark quickly called up 15 men, and they ran to the site of the gunfire. When the 9 natives noticed them, both parties walked towards each other, closer and closer. Clark writes that, I gave them my hand and inquired of them what they were shooting at. They informed me that they were shooting off their guns at an old keg which we had thrown out of one of the canoes and was floating down. Those Indians informed me that they were Yanktons. One of the men with me knew one of the Indians to be the brother of young Dorion's wife. Good news, a break. Clark sets the scenes where the 15 men were charging for 250 yards to potentially go to battle if the 3 hunters were under fire from hostile agents. But it was their friends the Yankton Sioux, and another stroke of luck had occurred for the Corps. Pipes were smoked, the Yanktons were given some corn and ribbons, the 2 groups happy to renew their friendships. John Ordway and Patrick Gass, who also wrote journal entries of this, on this day, spoke of the happy feelings and warm engagement of reuniting with the Yanktons. They were no doubt relieved to be out of the Teton territory. On the 4th, they passed by Sergeant Floyd's grave near present-day Sioux City, Iowa, and they made 36 miles that day. One final note for this week's podcast. Other than his entries in 1803, Meriwether Lewis leaves no surviving journal entries for this week, 1804, 1805, or 1806. His somewhat frequent lapses in keeping a journal is one of the enduring mysteries of the expedition. The majority of people seem to think that the gap can be explained by Lewis's personality. Those agreeing with this idea claim and defend that Lewis was a manic depressant, and as such was prone to not writing entries due to recurring long fits of depression. Those who do not subscribe to this interpretation of history suggest that the entries for those dates are simply lost, that Lewis did keep journal entries, and that they were just lost over time, either during or after the expedition. Both captains kept field notes, and often later transferred those to the lengthy journal entries that are passed down to us today. So that could be another factor of whether or not the field books were lost before Lewis could make a more accurate transcription. The fact that Lewis never indicates that he is about to stop making entries makes this whole argument compelling about the journals being lost. Indeed, there is no apparent degradation of his mind in any of the last entries before writing is ceased for a stretch of time. Equally so, in none of the first entries after each lapse does he mention past events or attempt to give some background to the things that have occurred since his last known entry. No, he simply writes the daily journal as if no lapse in journal entries has transpired. One exception occurs on August 11, 1806, while Lewis is recovering from a gunshot wound. He writes, "As writing in my present situation is extremely painful to me, I shall desist until I recover and leave to my friend Captain C the continuation of our journal." It seems compelling that he mentions a perceived stoppage of journal keeping, yet does not mention it at any other time on the multiple times previously where entries are missing. Why would he mention it now, yet failed to do so many times earlier in the expedition? But whatever the reason, the lapses in entries does exist, and until the lost entries of Meriwether Lewis are discovered in someone's attic or found tucked away in a library somewhere, we probably will never know for certain the explanation of the mystery. That concludes this week's podcast. Please join us again next week and subscribe to our YouTube page to learn just what the Corp of Discovery has in store for them and what they have in store for us as students of their journals. Thanks for listening.